Russia is not this sort of conservative Christian family values paradise that the current Russian regime portrays it as. And I think there's a real ignorance among many of these more pro-Russian conservatives in the West who are basically buying a false image of what contemporary Russia is like.
Do you think, generally speaking, America or Russia is the more religious country, a more observant country?
Oh, absolutely. America is much more religious. And I would say this kind of Russian propaganda operation against President Zelensky, who is ethnically Jewish, but not a practicing Jew, is very anti-Semitic. If you look at the way that he's described and the way that he's portrayed, it's just a very crude, vulgar Russian anti-Semitism.
Jamie, thank you for joining us today. We're talking about how Russia's talking points on the Christian church and on family values more generally are filtering into the discourse in the United States. Can we take a step back from that for a moment and look at where this all started and how it began?
Well, I think you could really point to the breakup of the Soviet Union because what really inspired the conservative movement for decades was anti-communism. And it brought together all the different elements of the conservative movement in America. It brought together the economic libertarians, the free marketers, who obviously hated communism because of its command control economy. It brought together the defense hawks, and it brought together, also very importantly, evangelical Christians and religious people in the religious right who detested the Soviet Union because it was godless communism. It was an atheist power. And once the Soviet Union collapsed and the communist control over Central and Eastern Europe withered away, I think one of the major pegs that kept conservatives as being hostile to Russia, not just skeptical, but hostile to Russia, was really removed.
I looked the man in the eye. I found it to be very straightforward and trustworthy.
And I think it would take another 2 decades for Vladimir Putin to really exploit this by playing up really the kind of pre-Soviet history of Russia and the control that the Russian Orthodox Church played. And he then began to manipulate that in a way in order to appeal to the same constituencies who during the Cold War, 20, 30, 40 years earlier, were quite hostile to Russia. He now was making the case, look, we're not communist anymore, and we're certainly not irreligious, we're not atheist anymore. We are actually the upholders of Christendom against your countries in the West, which are promoting secular liberal values.
How realistic of a picture is that?
Not at all. I mean, if you look at the abortion rates in Russia, extremely high. If you look at the divorce rates in Russia, also high. And most importantly, if you look at the church attendance rate, extremely low, okay? So Russia is not this sort of conservative Christian family values paradise that the current Russian regime portrays it as. And I think there's a real ignorance among many of these more pro-Russian conservatives in the West who are basically buying a false image of what contemporary Russia is like.
Putin ain't woke. He is anti-woke.
The Russians, people still know which bathroom to use.
They know how many genders are there in Russia?
2.
Do you think, generally speaking, America or Russia is the more religious country, a more observant country?
Oh, absolutely. America is much more religious. America is we might not be as religious as we used to be, okay? And church attendance may be going down, although it's now going up again, but it may be going down from where it was, say, 15, 20 years ago. But certainly more Americans, I believe, house of worship attendance in the United States is well over 50%. The percentage of people who identify as being a member of one type or another of organized religion is vastly higher than it is in Russia. I mean, you might not see it publicly because what Putin does very skillfully is he's used the church in Russia and its sort of satellites in the various former satellite countries of the Soviet Union. He's basically co-opted it as a political tool, much in the same way, by the way, that the communist regime did as well. So he'll do multiple events a year with the Orthodox priests and the leaders of the church. He will speak at churches. He will invoke religious imagery in a lot of his speeches and whatnot. And the Orthodox Church plays a very kind of pro-Russian social conservative role in the domestic politics of the countries around Russia. So, in Georgia, in Armenia, in the other former Soviet lands.
And increasingly in the United States.
And increasingly in the United States, yes. And in fact, Steve Witkoff, President Trump's envoy for various global issues, he met with Putin to discuss the conflict in Ukraine, and he came back and he gave an interview with Tucker Carlson.
President Putin told me a story, Tucker, about how when the president was shot, he went to his local church and met with his priest and prayed for the president, not because he was the president of he could become the president of the United States, but because he had a friendship with him and he was praying for his friend.
So that was a clearly, whether or not that happened, and I highly doubt that it did, that was a very sort of, KGB style use of propaganda, obviously aimed at persuading, convincing conservatives in the United States that Vladimir Putin, like Donald Trump, is a man of God.
How do you think the narratives from Russia have sort of translated and fit over the culture war here in the United States?
So in 2013 was a very important year, because that was the year that the Kremlin and its allies in the Duma, they passed a law that was called the prohibition on the propagation of non-traditional sexual roles to minors. And what this basically was a ban on really any sort of speech or expression that described homosexuality in a positive way. So it was a major violation of free speech and free expression. It passed overwhelmingly with only a single Duma member opposing it. And this became a really big issue in the West. I mean, I recall it getting a lot of attention in the Western media, because I think it was happening at a time where, the gay rights movement was really reaching its peak in terms of its success. So it would only be 2 years before the United States would legalize gay marriage.
They don't believe in God. How can you believe in God and be for LGBTQ plus minus divide on something? LGBT is it has nothing to do with God.
A lot of Americans admire Russia and admire you and admire Putin because you've been able to fight this off.
As we've seen over the past couple of years, these issues surrounding gender and sexuality have become major domestic political issues in the United States. It's even said that, one of the major reasons Donald Trump won in the last election was because of his views on transgender issues, and that there was one particular ad that was criticizing his opponent, Kamala Harris, that was one of the most persuasive ads in the history of American politics.
Kamala is for they, them. President Trump is for you.
So I think Putin was very, sort of deviously skillful and intelligent in seeing that development would happen. And then that same year, at the end of the year, he gave a speech where he basically positioned Russia as the defender of Western civilization, of Christian traditional values. And he contrasted Russia with what he compared as the genderless and infertile West. That's an actual quote from that speech. And shortly after he delivered that speech, you began to see some prominent figures on the paleo-conservative right. This is sort of the old right. It's not the George W. Bush, H.W. Bush, Reagan right. It's the right that existed anti-Eisenhower. Okay, that's how old this old right is. And so Pat Buchanan, who was probably the most prominent figure in that movement, he wrote an op-ed, praising Putin for this and saying, I believe the title of the column was Paleocons for Putin, or is Putin a paleocon? Something like that. So that's where I trace sort of the beginnings of what we've now seen over the past dozen years of using this issue primarily around sex, sexuality, and gender as a major divisive, dividing wedge within Western societies.
And what would you say to conservatives who have picked up his message with gusto?
I would say to them that Vladimir Putin is not a religious person, personally. He's certainly not a defender of Christian values. I don't think that bombing apartment buildings full of children and elderly people is a Christian value. He is repressing religious minorities in Russia. I mean, any religious movement that does not sort of follow Kremlin dictates will be oppressed in that country. And so I would hope that they would understand that the pluralism that we have in America and that we have in Western societies is actually the best system for religious people. Because if you opt for the Russian version, you basically have one man, an autocrat, who basically gets to decide on a whim whatever he wants to happen in that country. And if there is a religious denomination that is doing something that he does not like, he will stamp them out.
Would you add to that anything about Russia's behavior in Ukraine when it comes to culture and Christianity?
Oh, Vladimir Putin, and I would say this is kind of Russian propaganda operation against President Zelensky, who is ethnically Jewish, but not a practicing Jew, ethnically Jewish, is very anti-Semitic. If you look at the way that he's described and the way that he's portrayed, it is a direct echo of Russian anti-Semitism going back to the Tsarist period and also the communist period. It's just a very crude, vulgar Russian anti-Semitism. And for many years, Vladimir Putin was really seen, even by the Jewish community, was seen as actually a pretty good leader for the Jews in Russia because it was a very low bar if you look at all the leaders before him in history, but he was actually, he did not oppress the Jewish community in Russia. He was seen by many as being a philo-Semitic leader because of several influential people in his life who were Jewish. So he was seen by many people around the world, many Jewish people around the world, as being, he's obviously a horrible dictator, but when it comes to this particular issue, he's actually quite exceptional in terms of Russian history. That has changed, okay, really in the past 3 years since the full-on invasion of Ukraine. And you are now seeing, a number of Jewish Russians leaving Russia, just as they did or tried to do during the 1970s and 80s during the Soviet period. And many Christians in the West, in America in particular, conservative Christians, are very pro-Israel. They're very strongly against anti-Semitism. They say they are. They express their love for the Jewish people. And so that should also factor into their analysis of Vladimir Putin and whether he is a really good symbol of Christian political leadership.
Has he more generally been able to instrumentalize this purported support for Christianity as a way to drain support for Ukraine in the United States?
So it's been unfortunate over the past couple of years that we've seen the issue of Russia and Ukraine become partisan issues.
This is a war on Christianity. The Ukrainian government is attacking Christians. The Ukrainian government is executing priests.
It used to be that Democrats and Republicans were supportive of democracy in Russia, and they were supportive of democracy in Ukraine. They didn't like dictatorships in general. And for a variety of reasons, that really began to change around the start of the Trump era, when Donald Trump was running for president, and there were these questions about his connections to Russia, and Republicans accused Democrats of making these up. And so you had a situation where a lot of kind of rank and file Republicans, they began to see now Russia as being, I would say that their attitudes to Russia changed for the better, for the positive, because Democrats were becoming much more anti-Russia. And this was a big change, right? And we're talking about the party of Ronald Reagan. We're also talking about the party of Barack Obama, who in my opinion was very soft on Russia, who didn't give weapons to Ukraine after they had been invaded. Suddenly the parties were sort of changing sides on this issue. And I think that's very worrisome because on certain foreign policy issues, there really should be bipartisan unity. And I think that Russia would be one of them, and opposing Vladimir Putin's predations on his neighbors should be one of them. Now, do I think that the role of Christianity and the culture war is a significant factor in this declining support for Ukraine among American conservatives? I actually don't. I think it's mostly attributable to what I just described as these political dynamics, the whole issue of Ukrainian corruption surrounding Hunter Biden and the Biden family, and the phone call that Donald Trump made in the first impeachment. So what happened is that sort of Ukraine began to be seen by many Republicans, by many conservatives, as becoming a blue country, in the sense of our domestic red or Republicans, blue or Democrats. Many Republicans began to see Ukraine in this way, whereas before it had not had that sort of political tinge to it. So I think that's a very unfortunate thing, frankly. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Well, that's good. Thanks for having me.